This morning I talked about some of the dogmas of science and what happens when you turn them into questions. And this afternoon I'm going to start with the dogma that the laws of nature are fixed. This dogma has a long history, and it really goes back to ancient Greece. The ancient Greek philosophers were concerned with the nature of reality, and they thought reality was eternal. Probably they arrived at that idea through mystical experience. Many mystics have the experience there's a timeless realm which is more real than the world we live in. And in ancient Greece, they tried to turn this into a philosophical theory. Different philosophers had different answers to the nature of eternal reality. Pythagoras and his school thought the eternal reality was mathematical. It was outside space and time. There was a world of numbers, ratios, and proportions that were the basis of everything that happens in the world. Plato generalized this idea to the idea of an eternal realm of forms or ideas beyond space and time. Everything in this world is a reflection of these eternal archetypes. The materialists, Epicurus and Democritus, said that eternal reality was matter made up of lots of little bits, the atoms. In the 17th century, both atomism and Platonism were revived and built into the foundation of modern science. The idea was that God created the world machine, and in it he placed innumerable atoms which were eternal and were permanently present and would remain the same forever. God also gave the laws to nature, and the laws of nature were eternal ideas in the mind of God, mathematical ideas in the eternal mathematical mind of God. The reason that science achieved such an enormous prestige in the 17th and 18th centuries was because people thought that through science, men were directly finding out the inner mind of God. Science was superior to religion because it gave an absolute insight into the ultimate truths of nature. People didn't think that Newton's law of gravitation was a man-made hypothesis that just temporarily fitted the facts. They thought Newton had actually seen into the mind of God, and that science was revealing an absolute truth deeper and more important than that of religion, which was always based on conflicts and interpretations of dogma. So this gave the idea of eternal laws of nature. In the 19th century, most scientists thought the whole universe was eternal. They got rid of the idea of a creator God by saying matter and energy have always been there, and the laws that govern it have always been there. But in 1966, there was a huge revolution in cosmology with the acceptance of the Big Bang theory. The universe was now believed to begin about 14 billion years ago, very small and very hot, and it's been growing and expanding ever since. So this raises the question of the laws of nature. If we live in a radically evolutionary universe, what about the laws of nature? Could they also evolve? Well, this is not a possible question if you assume the laws are fixed. But as soon as you begin to think about it, you can question the very idea of law. The idea of law of nature is obviously a metaphor. It's an anthropocentric metaphor. Only humans have laws. In fact, only civilized societies. Tribes have customs. So in the 17th century, the metaphor was explicit. God was like the cosmic emperor, and he was also like the cosmic police force because he was omnipotent and made sure that everything obeyed the laws of nature. For many scientists today who are atheists, they can no longer believe in God as the source of the laws of nature or the cosmic police force, but these metaphors have persisted. Of course, the source of these metaphors is human laws, and human laws do evolve. the laws of Germany today are different from the laws 100 years ago. But I think a much better metaphor is habit. I think the universe has habits, not laws, and I think the regularities of nature depend on what's happened before. There's a kind of memory in nature. This is not just my own idea. It was put forward in the 19th century by several different philosophers, and most clearly at the beginning of the 20th century by the American philosopher C.S. Peirce. It was also suggested by William James. And as an idea, I think it's a much better idea than the idea of fixed laws. My own hypothesis of morphic resonance is a way of explaining the habits of nature, and I shall come back to that in a minute. But the advantage of evolving habits of nature is that we don't have to say they were all fixed at the beginning. At the moment, scientists have tied themselves into knots because of the assumption the laws are fixed at the beginning. Many of you will have heard of the cosmological anthropic principle. This argument has been going on for about 30 years, and some scientists have pointed out that the laws and constants of nature could have been different from what they are, and if they'd been even slightly different, life would not have evolved and we wouldn't be here to discuss it. So the fact that we exist and that we're talking about the nature of nature is itself telling us something about nature, because we could only exist if it's just right for us. And of all the possible laws and all the possible values of the constants, they're just right for us. So the argument starts from that assumption. Then there are two schools of thought. Everything was exactly right at the moment of the Big Bang so that we can evolve. So there are two possibilities on this argument. One is there's a creator God who's like a mathematician and engineer who fine-tunes the laws and constants of nature right at the beginning so it's exactly right for us to evolve. That's a kind of neo-deism, the doctrine that God is a kind of creator, a mathematical engineering creator who starts everything off, presses the start button, and then retires. And everything goes on automatically after that. The alternative to that is the idea that there are billions, trillions, quadrillions of actual universes, all with different laws and constants. And we know about this one because this is the only one we can exist in. So there's nothing special about this one except the fact we're in it. All the others actually exist. Now, believe it or not, most cosmologists, at least in the English-speaking world, are now believers in the multiverse theory, the billions of universes, for which there's not one shred of evidence. I was discussing this with Britain's Astronomer Royal, Lord Rees, who happens to be an old friend of mine. And I said to him, Martin, I said, surely this is the ultimate violation of Occam's razor. Occam's razor is the principle you shouldn't proliferate entities unnecessarily. And I said, and you've proliferated quadrillions of universes. And I said, isn't this an extremely extravagant hypothesis? And he said, well, I agree it's a bit of a problem, Occam's razor. He said, but this way we can get rid of God. So I said, you mean you prefer to have quadrillions of unobserved universes to God? He said, yes, it's much better. It's more scientific. But, of course, as theologians have pointed out, an infinite God could be the God of an infinite number of universes. So they haven't even got rid of God. They've just proliferated universes. The whole of this discussion just melts away if we assume that nature is based on habits that evolve. Things fit together because only successful habits can survive. Other ones die out. Only things that fit in with what's already there can survive and can become new habits. So this extraordinary scholastic argument about billions of universes versus a deistic creator is totally unnecessary if we adopt a truly evolutionary cosmology and think of the regularities as more like habits. I'll come back to the nature of morphic fields through which I suppose these habits are expressed. But first, I'll just talk about this using plain language in terms of habits. The theory of morphic resonance says that similar patterns of activity are influenced by similar past patterns that happened before. There's an influence, a kind of resonant influence of similarity across time and space from the past to the present. What this means is that each kind of thing has a collective memory. Each baby giraffe, as it develops as an embryo and grows into a giraffe, is shaped by the memory of the form of previous giraffes. As it starts behaving, it tunes in to the habits of previous giraffes. It has giraffe instincts. So each species has a collective memory. Each individual draws upon that collective memory and contributes to it. In the human realm, this idea is familiar from Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. But I'm suggesting this is a basic principle of all nature. It applies not only to living organisms, but also to crystals and proteins. I'm suggesting that when you first make a new chemical compound, when you first crystallize it, there won't be a pre-existing habit. You have to wait for a new form to come into being in nature. The second time you crystallize it, anywhere in the world, it should happen a bit easier because of the first crystals. The third time, easier still because of the first and the second crystals. As time goes on, it should get easier to crystallize all around the world. Is this true? Well, it's well known to chemists that new compounds are very difficult to crystallize to start with, and as time goes on, they get easier to crystallize all over the world. And this is simply taken for granted in chemistry. It's a common observation. But chemists don't explain it in terms of morphic resonance. They assume it happens because fragments of crystals were carried from laboratory to laboratory. Usually they assume they're blown there as invisible dust particles in the air. But I'm suggesting the same would happen even if you filter out these dust particles from the air. This theory also predicts that the habit of the crystal will get stronger as time goes on. It will become more stable, and it would be harder to disrupt the crystals, harder to break them down. The way you break crystals down is by heating them up until they reach the melting point, and then the crystal structure disappears. This theory predicts that new compounds should have lower melting points. As time goes on, the melting point should rise with new compounds. Old compounds have probably already reached a stable state, but you see this happening with new ones. That's a prediction. Do the melting points of new compounds increase? Well, strangely enough, they do seem to. And I've documented these. The data are in my books, A New Science of Life and The Presence of the Past. The data show that the melting points of many compounds that have been crystallized in the 20th century for the first time have gone up by 10 degrees, 15 degrees Celsius, sometimes 20 degrees Celsius. I'm talking big effects here, not fractions of a degree. This theory also applies to animal behavior. It predicts that if you train rats to learn a new trick in Frankfurt, then rats all over the world should be able to learn the same trick quicker just because the rats have learned it here by morphic resonance. It's part of the collective memory of these rats. Now, is this true? Well, there's already evidence that animals do learn things quicker if others have already learned it. One of the longest experiments in the history of rat psychology was carried out starting in the 1920s at Harvard by William McDougall. McDougall was trying to find out if animals could inherit if children could inherit what their parents had learned. He trained rats to escape from a water maze and measured how many errors it took before they learned how to do it. Then he trained their children. They learned quicker. Their grandchildren learned even quicker. And this was, of course, very controversial at the time because it suggested there was an inheritance of acquired characteristics, which was a taboo in Western science in the 20th century. It's now been rehabilitated, it's now mainstream. It's called epigenetic inheritance since about the year 2000. But the critics said to McDougall his experiments must be wrong. He must have been selecting the quicker learning rats unconsciously. He selected them because they thought he wanted to hurry the experiment up, so he picked the parents as the ones who'd learned quickest. He hadn't done that, but he agreed to test this, and he then did a new experiment to confront his critics. In every generation, he selected as parents of the next generation the most stupid rats. So every generation, they should have made more and more errors instead of less and less. What he found, oh, there we are. What he found was that the total number of errors to start with was more than 230 before they learned, and after 22 generations, it was down to about 35. So it was a huge change. This was such a big effect that his critics had to repeat this work. It was repeated in Scotland and in Australia. The Scottish and the Australian rats started more or less where the American ones had left off. But the interesting results were from Australia because they found that they tested a control line of rats whose parents had never been exposed to this maze. They got better too. They found a progressive increase, and all of them got better. So it wasn't anything to do with genes or modification of genes. They were all getting better. That's just what you would expect on the basis of morphic resonance. Now, the same should apply to people. It should be getting easier to program computers, to learn windsurfing, to play video games, just because so many people have already done this. And actually, most of these things do seem to be getting easier. But of course, there are many variables that affect this, including media, education, instructional videos on the internet, and so on. The only way you can get clear data is if you compare people's performance on the same test over years. And fortunately, this data does exist from data on average scores on intelligence tests. In the 1980s, I predicted that average scores on intelligence tests, on IQ tests, should be going up, not because people are getting more intelligent, but because the tests are getting easier to do, because so many people have already done them. And it turned out that this is exactly what's happening. All over the world, the scores on intelligence tests, the average scores, are going up. They've gone up by about 30%. Since 1918, when intelligence tests were first developed. This was discovered by a New Zealand scientist called James Flynn, and it's now called the Flynn effect. This shows the increase in average American intelligence since 1918. There's no other evidence that Americans have got more intelligent. Everyone agrees about that. But there's a lot of discussion as to how to explain the Flynn effect. There's 7 or 8 rival explanations, and none of them explain it. But I think this is exactly what we would predict on the basis of morphic resonance. So there are many people have done other tests for morphic resonance. These are summarized in the new edition of my book, A New Science of Life, which in German is Das Schöpferische Universum. And I won't go into those now, but there is more evidence for this. It's still not, obviously, it's still a hypothesis, it's still not completely proved, and it's still very controversial. But the evidence suggests that this may well be right. At least that's the way I understand the evidence. And many more tests are possible, and some are going on now. So I think that morphic resonance is a basic principle of nature. It applies to anything that's self-organizing. The most precise morphic resonance occurs when systems are very similar to each other. And if we're thinking about human beings, then when you ask the question, what human beings are most similar to each other, the answer is identical twins. This theory predicts that identical twins would have a very strong morphic resonance with each other precisely because they're so similar. The theory also predicts that if you separate identical twins soon after birth, they would still resonate with each other even if they're brought up in completely different environments because they're so similar. The theory predicts that identical twins separated soon after birth would continue to be very similar for many years. As you know, there have been many studies on identical twins because there's been a long debate in science about the relative influence of genes and the environment, or nature and nurture. Studies on identical twins have shown remarkable similarities. And this is usually interpreted to mean, therefore, it's all genetically programmed. In fact, the whole edifice of genetic determinism, which is so important today in people's thinking, is based on these identical twin studies. It's not that people have considered morphic resonance and ruled it out. They haven't even considered it. And I think this evidence actually fits morphic resonance much better than the genetic explanation. If we pursue this line of thought about similarity, and we ask the question, who in the past is most similar to me or to you? The answer is yourself or myself. We're more similar to ourselves in the past than to anybody else. Therefore, we should have the most specific morphic resonance with ourselves more than with anyone else, because we're not as similar to anyone else. That would mean that much of the influence working on us from the past, both in form and behavior and memory, would come through morphic resonance. Our bodies remain more or less the same shape over many years. People can still recognize us when we meet them after 10 or 20 years. But almost all the molecules in our bodies have changed and many of the cells have changed, yet the form remains. And I think this is because of self-resonance. We resonate with ourselves, and this maintains a continuity of form. I think this is also the basis of memory. I think when you remember what you did yesterday or last year or when you were a child, I don't think those memories are stored inside your brain. I think that it's because you're similar to yourself, you're resonating with yourself in the past, and the memories, as it were, leap across space, from you in the past, across space and time, from you in the past to you in the present by a kind of resonance. Now, this brings me to another of the dogmas of materialism. Memories are stored in the brain. This is simply taken for granted by scientists and indeed by most people, because they usually take the view, well, they must be in the brain, where else could they be? But people within science have tried to find memories in the brain for more than 100 years, and they've had an extremely disappointing time. In the 1940s and 50s, an American scientist, Carl Lashley, trained rats to learn a whole variety of tricks, and then he cut out bits of their brain to see if he could find out where the memories were stored. To his surprise, he found that it didn't really matter which bits of the brain you cut out. You could cut out large areas of the brain, the right, the left, the front, the back, and they still remembered. Of course, if you cut out the whole brain, they couldn't behave anymore. So he showed the brain is necessary for behavior, but not for specific memories. And similar research with octopuses led to the same conclusion. And the researchers who did that said that memory seems to be both everywhere and nowhere in particular within the brain. Carl Pribram, a neuroscientist, reacted to these findings by suggesting that memories are stored holographically, over large regions of the brain. They're all there everywhere. So if you cut out one bit, they can survive somewhere else. People have gone on trying to find memories in the brain, and over again, their experiments have drawn a blank. Some well-known research by Wilder Penfield involved stimulating parts of people's brains during operations for epilepsy, and he found he could sometimes evoke memories. But that doesn't prove the memories are stored in that bit of brain, and in fact, Penfield himself came to the conclusion that they weren't. It just shows that bit of the brain may be involved in retrieving the memories. Philosophers have also pointed out that memory storage in the brain is very problematic. The standard theory is that memories are stored in the brain, and when you need the memory, a retrieval system then retrieves the memory from the store. But as several philosophers have pointed out, for the retrieval system to know which memory to retrieve from the store, it has to have a memory itself to know what it's looking for. And that must itself have another retrieval system, and so you have an infinite regress. But neither philosophical arguments nor the failure to find memory traces have made the slightest difference to the conventional assumption in neuroscience that memories are in the brain, because people assume there's no alternative. It must be the case. Even if we can't find them, they must be there. I think the failure to find them has a very simple explanation. They're not there. And it's rather like me coming along to your house and trying to find out what programs you watched on television yesterday by analyzing the wires and transistors of your TV set. I wouldn't find any trace of those programs, because that's not how it works. And I think our brain is more like a TV receiver tuning into our memories, not a video recorder storing them. So this leads to a quite different interpretation of memory, and one that I think makes much better sense of the facts. I'm now going to come on to the details of my own hypothesis as to how morphic resonance works. All of what I've said so far could work on a general theory of resonance without much detail. I mean, you could get as far as I've said with all those tests without any more detailed theory. But I myself started out as a developmental biologist, interested in how plants develop. And these considerations are very relevant to developmental biology. And this, again, is one of the unsolved problems of biology. No one really understands how organisms develop from a fertilized egg. Many people naively assume that the genes explain this. People talk of a genetic program or genetic instructions. But actually, genes don't explain the shape of your face or the shape of your arms and your legs or the shape of your kidney. What genes explain is the sequence of amino acids in proteins. That's what they do. They code for the sequence of amino acids in proteins. And some genes are involved in the control of protein synthesis. They're not instructions for your form, behavior, or instincts. That's just a fantasy. People have tried to cram all heredity into the genes because they think there's nowhere else it could be. But if we inherit those things through morphic resonance, then there's no need for them all to be in the genes. Genes are grossly overrated. And the entire genome sequencing project, the genetic modification project, large chunks of modern biology, biotechnology, are based on this enormous overestimation of genes. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been wasted in research that has found out something, but has certainly not revealed the secret of life as people originally promised. I think that these are expressed through what I call morphic fields, fields concerned with shape or form. And this is part of a holistic philosophy of nature. Everything in nature is made up of levels of organization, and at each level the whole is more than the sum of the parts. These small circles could be subatomic particles within atoms, and then these atoms could be in molecules, and the molecules could be in a crystal. At each level, there's an organizational wholeness that's more than the sum of the parts. All these could be organelles inside cells, in tissues, in organs, in organisms, in societies of organisms. All holistic models of nature have this idea of nested hierarchies or holarchies of organization. My suggestion is that the wholeness at each level that's more than the sum of the parts is a morphic field, a form-shaping field, a field of form or pattern, from the Greek word morphe, meaning form. And that these fields have a memory built into them through morphic resonance. So at every level, the wholeness has a kind of memory, which comes through morphic resonance, expressed through these fields. This is just to remind you of the primary source of this field concept, which is magnetic fields. The term field was introduced into science in the 1840s by Michael Faraday, who was studying magnetic fields and electric fields. And a field is scientifically defined as a region of influence. The magnetic field around the magnet is inside the magnet too, but you don't see it normally, but if you sprinkle iron filings, then you see the shape, the structure of the field, as in this familiar picture here. In the 1920s, when people were thinking about developmental biology, they came up with the idea of morphogenetic fields, fields that shape form. The Greek words morphe and genesis mean form and coming into being. Morphogenesis is the coming into being of form. Morphogenetic fields are fields that shape the form of developing organisms. As Marco said this morning, this idea was first put forward by Alexander Gurvich in Russia and Paul Weiss in Vienna. And this field concept has become quite well established within biology. These are biological or morphogenetic fields that shape developing organisms. The fields themselves are organized in nested hierarchies. There's a field for the whole body, for the organs, for the tissues, for the cells, and so on. What are these fields? The term is still widely used within biology. And when I was doing research on developmental biology of plants, I got interested in this concept because I was sure we needed something like that. Let me just explain a little bit more why we need this concept. The chemistry of the genes and the proteins and bone and connective tissue is simply not enough to explain form. Chemically, your arms and your legs are identical. They contain identical genes, and yet they have different forms. So something else must be shaping the form. It's rather like a building. If you're trying to understand a house, then of course it contains building materials, bricks, cement, timber, and so on. But that doesn't completely explain the form of the house because there's the architect's plan as well. If you demolish the house, you can analyze the materials in the house, but the plan disappears. This is a bit like biochemistry and molecular biology, which starts by killing organisms and grinding them up and then extracting the molecules. When they do that, the whole of the form disappears, and it doesn't weigh anything. It's not something you can crystallize in a test tube. It's simply ignored, and therefore it can never be explained just by looking at the building materials, any more than the building materials could explain the form of a house. Now, of course, if you have defective building materials, you'll get a defective house. So they have some influence, but they don't explain the form. The morphogenetic fields are there to explain the form. And in some way, they're rather like Aristotle's idea of the soul, which is the form of the body, which attracts the developing organism towards it. But it's a more modern conception of a similar idea. These fields are not in the nucleus. Single cells have morphogenetic fields. These are radiolarians, single-celled organisms that have skeletons, mineral skeletons. These live in the sea. Each species has a completely different form. Each species has one nucleus, and switching on and off genes couldn't possibly explain these forms. There has to be a structure within the cell that somehow shapes them. These are famous pictures of radiolarians by Ernst Haeckel, the great German evolutionary biologist, showing this extraordinary range of forms. These are pollen grains of different species. These, again, are single cells which have characteristic forms. And this is acetabularia. It's a single-celled alga. Each of these is a single plant. They're about 5 centimeters long, and they have a cap and a stalk, and then in the base they have a little root, and the nucleus is in the root. There's just one nucleus. It's a single-celled organism, even though it's 5 centimeters long. And again, all that shape comes about from just one nucleus making the right proteins. But you can't explain this form by the nucleus being a kind of brain of the organism. It isn't. It's just the source of the right information for making the right proteins. And this is a bat embryo, reminding us that in complex organisms there are many levels of organization. There are the bones, the organs, the ribs, the eyes, and so forth. Each of these have their own morphogenetic fields within the overall field of the whole organism. One of the reasons why people put forward the idea of morphogenetic fields in the first place was because organisms have extraordinary abilities to regenerate. Fields have a holistic property, unlike machines, which means they can remain whole even if you break systems down. If you cut a magnet in half, you don't get 2 half magnets, you get 2 small but complete magnets. All field phenomena are intrinsically holistic. Now, that's not true of machines. If you cut a computer in half, all you get is a broken computer. But with living organisms, if you cut them into small parts, the parts can often regenerate into a whole organism. If you cut a willow tree into small cuttings, each cutting can give you a whole new tree. These are dragonfly eggs. On the left is a normal dragonfly egg with the embryo inside the egg case. On the right, it was tied in the middle and the top half was killed. The lower half now gives rise to a small but complete organism, not the back end of an organism, but a small but complete organism. This is rather like cutting a magnet in half and having each half with its north and south pole. It still has a complete field. And these show the regeneration of the planaria, the flatworm, which, cut in various ways, gives parts, each of which can regenerate a complete worm. And this is acetabularia, which I showed you a little while ago. Surprisingly, if you cut out a bit of the stalk, leaving behind the nucleus, which is in the root bit, this stalk can regenerate and give a new cap to the acetabularia in the absence of any nucleus, showing it's not the nucleus that's controlling this process. After a few weeks, it dies because it needs the nucleus to make new proteins, to replace proteins. But the nucleus is not a brain controlling this process. And this shows a very remarkable regeneration in the eye of a newt or salamander. The lens was surgically removed, and what happens now is that a new lens grows from the edge of the iris. In normal development, the lens grows from a folding in of the skin on the outside. But here, it forms in a completely new way to regenerate a functioning eye. So regeneration suggests that things are not produced just mechanistically. There's a holistic field which underlies this process. And this is one of the reasons that the idea of morphogenetic fields is widely adopted within biology. But then the question is, what are these fields and how do they work? Most biologists admit we need some kind of field, but what they say is, well, eventually we'll just explain them in terms of conventional physics and chemistry. We don't know how they work, but let's assume it turns out that they're nothing really new, there's some conventional explanation. Other people, usually ex-mathematicians who've turned to biology, say, well, if they exist, they must have an equation, and all we need to do is find out the field equation, and then we'll have explained it. Because they're basically Platonists, and they think the ultimate explanation is going to be mathematical. But I take a third view. I don't think that they're just existing fields. I think they're a new kind of field. And I don't think mathematical models would explain them. We can make mathematical models of them, but those are man-made models that illuminate some aspect of the field. But the maths is not more real than the field. The field is more real than the mathematical model. Anyway, my own theory is that these fields are a new kind of field. They do shape and organize the organisms, and they have a kind of memory within them. In my books, Das Schöpferische Universum, A New Science of Life, and The Presence of the Past, which in German is Das Gedächtnis der Natur, I talk about the way in which these fields work. Their probability structures, like quantum fields, they influence indeterminate events by restricting their indeterminacy to impose patterns upon them. And I go into various details as to how I think they might work. But this just gives you a flavor of the kind of things they might be. What I'm going to do now is talk about the morphic fields of social groups, because fields apply not only to whole organisms and to organs within them, but they apply to the way that groups of organisms are organized. Here we see a flock of starlings. As they fly around, these birds can change direction very rapidly without bumping into each other. It's a very remarkable sight. And we see something similar with schools of fish. They're swimming in this direction, and they can move very rapidly, they can change direction very fast without bumping into each other. The best computer models of these fields, of these flocks and swarms, are field models. And I think what we have is a field of the whole group. The members of the group are linked through a field which shapes the way the individuals behave. I think social organization in ants and termites and bees and wasps and in many other animal groups, in all animal groups, is organized by morphic fields of the group. Normally, when they group are together, as in this case, the field coordinates their immediate behavior in relation to each other. But even if they move apart, I think they remain connected through these morphic fields. For example, packs of wolves are bonded through their time together as a pack, but when the adult wolves go out hunting, they leave the baby wolves, the cubs, in a den, usually with a babysitter, and then they roam over hundreds of kilometers hunting. I think the field that links them is not broken, it stretches. It stretches a bit like an invisible elastic band, connecting the separated members of the group. Another way of thinking about this is in terms of quantum non-locality. In quantum physics, if particles have been part of the same system, when they move apart, they can remain connected or entangled so that a change in one instantaneously affects the other. Einstein thought quantum theory must be wrong because if it was true, it would allow for what he called spooky action at a distance. Experiments show Einstein was wrong, quantum theory is right. There is spooky action at a distance, however you interpret it. And I think this provides the best analogy for connections between members of social groups. I'm not saying it's homologous, I'm saying it's analogous. Interestingly, this connection in quantum non-locality does not fall off with distance, nor does the connection between members of social groups. If you feel very fond of your parents or your children, you still feel fond of them and still feel attached to them, even if they're hundreds of kilometers away. You don't get less fond of them as they get further away. In fact, we have an English proverb that suggests exactly the opposite. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. The connection between members of social groups at a distance is, I think, the basis of telepathy. Telepathy is a form of communication among members of social groups which can occur when they're beyond the range of the normal senses. I think it also occurs when they're close together, but it's harder to separate it from body language and normal means of communication. I think this is a normal, not paranormal, means of communication between members of animal groups. And because I think it's a basic feature of animal behavior, I started my investigations with animals. And I started them with the animals we know best, dogs and cats and other animals. And the starting point, because there'd been no previous scientific research on telepathy in animals of this kind, my starting point was to ask people about their experience with dogs and cats. I asked animal trainers, police dog handlers, vets, pet owners, blind people with guide dogs, and so on, about their experiences. And I now have a database with more than 5,000 of these stories. Some people say you shouldn't listen to people's stories, they're just anecdotes. I heard that so often. I looked up the word anecdote in the dictionary, and it literally means unpublished. An in Greek is not, ekdotos is published. An anecdote is an unpublished story. As soon as it's published, by definition, it stops being an anecdote. It's promoted to the rank of a case history, and medicine is based on them. So for me, the plural of anecdote is data. And if you have hundreds of stories from people all over the world describing the same kind of phenomenon with their animals, at least I think this means something's going on, at least something's making people believe this. Their belief may be a false belief, but at least many people are independently reporting similar thing. Most of my colleagues take the line that if thousands of ordinary people say something's happening, it must be untrue. I take the opposite opinion. I think if thousands of ordinary people say something's happening, it's probably true, and it's worth investigating. The phenomenon I've investigated most is the ability of dogs to know when their owners are coming home. Many people have found the dog waits at a door or window when the person is on the way home, and sometimes 10 minutes or more before they return. Dr. Van Lommel told me this morning at breakfast he had a dog that did this, and his wife knew when he was going to come home because it was waiting 10 minutes beforehand. It's a very common phenomenon, and let's just see how many people in this room have got now or have had dogs or cats or other animals that know when they're coming home. Yes, thank you. That's quite a lot of people, you see. This is not a rare phenomenon. I've done experiments to test what's going on. The skeptics say it's just routine, it's just hearing cars and that sort of thing. We've done experiments where we film the dog the whole time the person is out. We know the exact time on the film. We have people come at random times that they don't know in advance. We have them come by taxi or by other unfamiliar vehicle, and the dogs still know over and over again. This research is summarized in my book, which in English is called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home. In German, it's Der siebte Sinn der Tiere. And so there's now a lot of evidence that animals can do this. Telepathy in animals is quite common. In fact, animals are much better at it than most people. But of course, in the human realm, the same principles apply. Telepathy occurs between people who are socially or emotionally bonded. It doesn't usually happen with strangers. It happens with mothers and babies, mothers and children, lovers, husbands and wives, best friends, therapists and clients, where there's a transference and countertransference, and people and close colleagues. It doesn't happen with insurance salesmen and other sort of strangers. So this phenomenon is widely experienced. Most people in the population have had these experiences, and yet this is regarded as illusory. This is the dogma psychic phenomena are illusory, dogma 9 that I referred to this morning. I think telepathy is actually quite common, and I've studied it in the places where it's most biological. A lot of parapsychology has been based on extremely artificial situations, people guessing cards that random strangers are looking at, or sitting in rooms with earphones on and dim red light, trying to think what somebody else is looking at in another room, usually with strangers. These experiments work much better with people who are closely linked, and indeed parapsychology researchers have found that out too. I've looked at things that are much more common and everyday. Many mothers, for example, claim that they can tell when their baby needs them. When nursing mothers are breastfeeding, many of them find that after they go back to work or they start leaving their baby a few months after the birth, and they're still breastfeeding, they sometimes feel their milk lets down when they're at work. There's no sound of a baby, nothing's happening. Suddenly their breasts start producing milk, their breasts start tingling. This is the milk letdown reflex mediated by oxytocin. And most mothers, when that happens, assume that their baby needs them. And they ring home on their mobile phone, and they're usually right. I've done a detailed study on nursing mothers and their babies, and I've found that the odds against chance of this happening are about 1 billion to 1. It's a highly significant effect, and it's not just explained by synchronized rhythms. This is a very basic biological form of telepathy, and I'm sure natural selection would have favored it. Mothers who could tell when their child or their baby needed them, when they were far away from it, beyond the range of hearing them crying, would have babies that would survive better than mothers that didn't know. And I think there'd be a very good reason natural selection would favor the developments of these abilities, especially in women. But the commonest kind of telepathy by far within the modern world occurs in connection with modern technology, namely telephone telepathy. Many people have had the experience of thinking of someone who then rings, and they say, "That's funny, I was just thinking about you." I've done surveys on this phenomenon in various countries, and they've shown that about 95% of women say they've had this experience, compared with about 72% of men. Now, many more women than men have had this telephone telepathy, but even the majority of men have had it. I've done these surveys in Germany, Britain, North America, and South America, in Argentina. Women everywhere come out to around 95%. There are more national differences between men. Argentinian men are the most sensitive, and British men the least. These are other kinds of telepathy. Again, women more than men, but much less than telephone telepathy. So this is the commonest kind in the modern world. Now, skeptics for a long time have dismissed this phenomenon by saying, well, it's just coincidence. You think of people all the time. If one of them rings, you imagine it's telepathy, and you forget the millions of times you're wrong. Now, for 100 years, they've got away with that as a hypothesis without a shred of evidence. But I set up experiments to test this. In my experiments, the subject picks 4 people they know well, friends or family members. They sit at home on a landline telephone. They're filmed to make sure they're not getting emails or other phone calls. We pick one of the 4 callers at random by throwing a dice. We ring them up and ask them to call the subject. The phone rings. They know it's one of these 4 people. Before they pick it up, they have to say who it is. I think it's Mary. They pick it up. Hello, Mary. By chance, you'd be right 1 time in 4, 25%. In these experiments, the actual hit rate, here's the chance rate of 25%. The actual hit rate was 45%. And the p-value for this was done with hundreds of trials. The probability value is 1 times 10 to the minus 12. For those of you who are into statistics, I should point out this makes it more likely than the existence of the Higgs boson. We also did these tests where 2 of the 4 callers were familiar people, and the other 2 were unfamiliar people that they'd never met. And this showed very clearly that it works with familiar, but hardly at all with unfamiliar people. And this just summarizes some of the results. It's a new way of testing for telepathy, highly significant positive results, no effect of distance. We did these experiments between Britain and Australia. We recruited young Australians and New Zealanders in Britain, and we tested with 2 callers they'd recently met in Britain and 2 people back home, their mothers, people they were close to. And it worked actually better with the people in Australia because they were closer to them emotionally, even though they were further physically. It's been replicated at the University of Amsterdam and at the University of Freiburg in Germany. It's very good for student projects, and it agrees with common experience. I've done similar experiments with emails, SMS messages, and I'm about to launch a new application on Facebook, so people can do this through social media. I also have an automated telepathy test working on mobile phones. Not yet in Germany, it works in Britain and America, where people can just do this experiment at any time with their friends. So this research can now break out of the laboratory and become part of ordinary life. And in fact, in this research on telepathy, I've concentrated on what I call the mysteries of everyday life, because these things are happening all the time. And yet the dogmatic assumptions of materialism have managed to deny so much of our own experience. First of all, they've denied that our images are out there where they seem to be. Secondly, they've made people say, oh, our pets aren't really psychic, it's just coincidence. They deny the sense of being stared at. They deny telepathy. They deny the importance of belief on our behavior and indeed in medicine, although that's now accepted through the placebo effect. But if we sweep away these dogmas and look at things in an open-minded way, the scientific evidence actually supports the reality of these experiences which most of us have had personally. And I think when we admit the reality of these things, we learn something important. We are connected with each other at a distance. Our minds do extend beyond our brains. Our intentions affect other people. A dog is affected by your intention to come home. It's a measurable effect. People are affected by your intention to telephone them. That's why they think about you just before the call comes. Our intentions can affect people at a distance. All these are things that almost everybody knows already. And sometimes people say to me, unsophisticated people, sometimes say to me, why do you waste your time trying to prove things that everyone already knows? And it's true that most people do already know these things, but the intellectual, educated part of them is forced to deny it, because if you don't deny it, people think you're stupid or uneducated or superstitious. I think the real superstition is this dogmatic belief in materialism. It's hung over from a previous age. It's not appropriate to the facts as we know them. And I think science, liberated from these dogmas, can become more scientific, not less so. I think it'll become more interesting and more fun. Thank you.